The emergency signal reached every corner of the Galactic Council chambers within seconds of the explosion at Keeper's Gate Station, and the assembled representatives from 47 species fell silent as the visual feed displayed the scattered debris field where a human diplomatic vessel had been only moments before Council Arbiter. Valamon stood at the central podium, his 6 eyes blinking in rapid succession as he processed the incoming data streams that confirmed what everyone feared. 847 souls had been aboard that vessel, including Ambassador Marcus Chun, Earth's chief negotiator for the Outer Rim trade agreements, the Genitar Supremacy's representative. A towering figure with crystalline skin that reflected the chamber's lights in sharp angles rose from his seat without being called upon and declared that the destruction had been a necessary preemptive strike against what his government termed aggressive human expansion into contested territories. Valamon had served as council arbiter for 3 decades and had mediated hundreds of disputes between species, and he knew the protocols by heart. There would be heated debate, calls for sanctions, perhaps reparations paid over a generation or two, and eventually both sides would find a middle ground that allowed them to save face while avoiding actual conflict. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for only 70 years, barely a moment in the grand timeline of galactic politics, and in that time they had proven themselves to be reasonable beings who valued trade and cultural exchange over military posturing, which made them predictable and easy to manage in Valamon's experienced opinion. Council chamber buzzed with overlapping translations as representatives debated the appropriate response, and several species offered to mediate between Earth and the Genitar Supremacy, while others suggested forming an investigative committee to examine the disputed territorial claims that had supposedly provoked the attack. Valamon privately calculated that the whole matter would be resolved within 6 standard months, with the Genitar paying perhaps 10 billion credits in reparations and offering a formal apology that their propaganda networks would spin as a diplomatic victory, while Earth's leadership would present it as justice served to their population. 3 days after the incident, Earth's representative requested an emergency session of the full council, and Valamon granted it as a formality, expecting to hear humanity's list of demands and grievances that would form the opening position in what would become lengthy negotiations. Director Sarah Okonkwo entered the chamber alone, without the usual retinue of advisors and legal experts that typically accompanied species making formal presentations to the council, and she carried no data tablets or holographic displays, which Valamon found unusual but attributed to human inexperience with proper diplomatic protocols. She walked to the speaker's platform with measured steps, her dark eyes scanning the assembled representatives with an expression that Valamon's cultural database suggested indicated calm determination, though he privately thought she looked remarkably composed for someone whose government had just lost nearly 1,000 citizens to an unprovoked attack. The chamber fell silent as she reached the podium, and Valamon noticed that unlike most speakers who fidgeted with their translation devices or shuffled notes, Okonkwo simply stood still and waited for complete silence before she spoke. The Genitar Supremacy destroyed a clearly marked diplomatic vessel in neutral space, she began, her voice clear and steady as the translation systems rendered her words into 46 different languages simultaneously. They murdered 847 human beings, including children who were traveling with their families to the trade conference at Keeper's Gate. Valamon nodded slightly, recognizing this as the expected opening statement that would be followed by demands for justice, calls for council intervention, and the beginning of negotiation posturing that all species engaged in when seeking redress for grievances. Ambassador Chun spent 15 years working to build bridges between our species and the wider galactic community, Okonkwo continued. And Valamon noticed that her hands remained perfectly still at her sides, showing none of the nervous gestures that usually accompanied such emotional topics. He believed that dialogue and mutual understanding could resolve any conflict. The Xenatar representative shifted in his seat, his crystalline features catching the light as he prepared what Velamon assumed would be a counter-argument about territorial sovereignty and the right to defend one's borders against perceived threats. Earth's government has reviewed the evidence, consulted with our military leadership, and received the unanimous consent of our planetary legislature, Okonkwo said. And something in her tone made Velamon's primary heart skip a beat, though he could not have explained why at that moment she reached into her jacket and withdrew a small data chip, which she inserted into the podium's universal reader, and the main display screens throughout the chamber activated to show an official document bearing Earth's governmental seals and signatures from every major human political entity, effective immediately. Humanity formally declares a state of war against the Xenatar supremacy, Okonkwo stated. And the chamber erupted into chaos as representatives jumped to their feet. Translators struggled to keep up with the cacophony of shocked exclamations. And Valamon's 3 decades of experience suddenly seemed inadequate to process what he had just heard. War declarations were ceremonial formalities, empty gestures that species made before sitting down to negotiate in earnest. And no one in living memory had actually followed through on such declarations because actual warfare was economically disastrous and politically unthinkable in an interconnected galactic community. The Xenatar representatives' laughter cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and dismissive, and he declared that his people would not be intimidated by the posturing of a young species that barely controlled 3 star systems and possessed a military force that could fit inside a single Xenatar battle group. Volman raised his primary manipulator appendage for silence, and when order was finally restored, he addressed Okonkwo with what he hoped was a calming tone, explaining that formal war declarations were typically followed by a list of demands and conditions for peace, and he invited her to present Earth's terms so that productive negotiations could begin. "There are no terms," Okonkwo replied, and her expression had not changed since she entered the chamber, still displaying that same calm determination that Velamon now found deeply unsettling. "We are not negotiating." She touched the podium's interface again, and the display changed to show a star chart with a specific location marked in red, along with a countdown timer that read 71 hours and 43 minutes. "This is the location where the Xenatar Supremacy's 3rd Fleet is currently stationed," she said. And Valamon noticed that every military attach in the chamber had suddenly become very attentive. Their various sensory organs focused entirely on the human woman at the podium in 72 hours. "They will understand what it means to declare war on Deathworlders," Okonkwo stated. And then she simply walked away from the podium, ignoring the flood of questions and demands for clarification that followed her to the chamber doors. The transmission ended with the image frozen on that countdown timer, and Valamon realized with growing horror that he had no framework for understanding what had just happened, because in all his experience, no species had ever simply declared war and walked away without negotiating. The Xenatar representative was still laughing, calling it an obvious bluff from a species that lacked the military strength to challenge even a minor power, let alone a supremacy that controlled 7 sectors and commanded fleets numbering in the thousands of vessels. But Velamon remembered the look in Akumo's eyes, that calm and unwavering certainty, and he accessed Earth's classification in the Council database, noting for the first time a designation he had never paid attention to before. Class 12 Deathworld did not sleep well that night, and when he did dream, he saw that countdown timer ticking steadily toward 0 while the galaxy waited to see if humanity was bluffing or if something terrible was about to unfold that none of them were prepared to witness. The academic networks across the galaxy lit up with frantic research requests within hours of Earth's war declaration, and xenobiologists who had spent their careers studying species compatibility and evolutionary patterns suddenly found themselves answering questions about human psychology and Deathworld adaptations from military analysts who had never cared about such things before. Kier Ith of the Sanctuary Collective had written her doctoral thesis on Deathworld species integration into galactic society, and she sat in her cluttered office, surrounded by holographic displays showing Earth's environmental data while her communication panel blinked with 47 unread messages from governments requesting consultation. The classification was clear enough in the database, Class 12 Deathworld, which placed Earth in the highest category of planetary danger ratings. And Kareth had visited the planet once during her research, spending 3 carefully controlled days in a biodome near what humans called the Amazon Basin. She remembered standing at the reinforced viewing window and watching a thunderstorm roll across the jungle canopy. The lightning strikes so frequent and violent that her sanctuary physiology had triggered an involuntary fear response that left her trembling for hours afterward. And the human guide had laughed gently and explained that this was considered normal weather. The gravity alone should have been enough to warrant serious concern, she thought as she reviewed her notes, because Earth's pull was 38% higher than the galactic standard, which meant that every human carried the equivalent of combat weights simply by existing on their own world. But it was the biological data that truly disturbed her, and she created a new presentation file to organize the patterns she was seeing. Because if she was right about what humanity represented, then the Genetar supremacy had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Earth's evolutionary history read like a horror story to any civilized species. Mega predators that hunted in coordinated packs, environmental conditions that shifted so rapidly that adaptation was the only survival strategy, and disease vectors so aggressive that human immune systems were essentially military-grade biological warfare platforms compared to most galactic species. Kier It pulled up human cultural databases and began cross-referencing what they called entertainment. And she felt her tertiary stomach clench as she realized that humans created simulated combat scenarios for recreation, that their children played games involving tactical warfare, and that their most popular stories celebrated violence as a legitimate problem-solving method. The Sanctuary Collective had banned violent entertainment 3,000 years ago, and Kareth had always assumed that was normal for any advanced civilization. But humans apparently found watching simulated death matches relaxing after what they termed a long day at work. She drafted a report to her government outlining her findings, and the core thesis was simple but terrifying. Humans were not just survivors of a death world. They were apex predators who had conquered their planet through 10,000 years of continuous warfare against nature, animals, and each other. Their sports involved physical contact that would hospitalize members of most species, she wrote, and their concept of extreme activities included throwing themselves off cliffs with fabric wings or diving into water from lethal heights purely for what they called the adrenaline rush. The military implications were obvious once she started looking for them, and Karith created a secondary file documenting human organizational behavior under stress, noting that every major human civilization had developed through what they casually referred to as periods of conflict that killed millions and reshaped entire continents. Humans formed their strongest social bonds through shared adversity, she noted, and their loyalty to group members who had fought beside them was so intense that it often overrode rational self-interest and survival instincts. She found records of human soldiers who had thrown themselves on explosive devices to save their companions, of civilians who had hidden refugees at risk of their own execution, and of individuals who had endured torture rather than betray their communities. And none of this was considered exceptional behavior by human standards. The communication panel continued blinking with new messages, and Karith finally opened the priority channel from the Genitar Supremacy Strategic Analysis Division, where a military commander she had never met before was demanding immediate consultation on human combat capabilities. She agreed to a real-time communication link. And when the Genitar commander's image appeared, his crystalline features were arranged in what her translation software indicated was a dismissive expression. "We understand you have studied the human species," the commander said, his tone suggesting he was humoring a civilian academic. "Our analysts need to confirm that their war declaration is purely ceremonial posturing before we finalize our response strategy." Karith felt the urge to simply disconnect the call and let the Genitar discover the truth themselves. But her training as a scientist overrode the impulse, and she instead pulled up her presentation file and began sharing the data. "Humans are not posturing," she said carefully, watching the commander's expression shift as environmental statistics filled his screen. "They are a Class 12 Deathworld species whose entire evolutionary history prepared them for exactly this kind of conflict." The commander waved a dismissive manipulator appendage and argued that environmental adaptation did not translate to military capability, that the Genitar supremacy outnumbered humanity 50-1, and that no rational species would actually follow through on a war declaration when the odds were so obviously against them. "That is your first mistake," Karith replied, pulling up comparative psychology files. "You are assuming humans operate under the same rational framework as civilized species who evolved on garden worlds where cooperation and negotiation were survival strategies." She showed him human literature, pointing out that their heroes were overwhelmingly individuals who fought impossible odds, who sacrificed themselves for abstract concepts like honor and justice, and who were celebrated specifically for refusing to surrender even when defeat was mathematically certain. Their children's stories feature violence as the primary conflict resolution method, she continued, highlighting a collection of what humans called fairy tales. They teach their young that sometimes the correct response to a threat is not negotiation, but elimination. The commander's expression had shifted from dismissive to uncertain, and Karith pressed her advantage by displaying human military history, showing conflicts where human forces had continued fighting even after losing 60, 70, or 80% casualties. "Notice the pattern," she said, tracking her manipulator across the timeline. "Human military forces do not retreat based on casualty percentages. They retreat based on mission completion or explicit orders to withdraw. And their concept of acceptable losses is far higher than any species you have encountered." She pulled up the final piece of evidence, human bonding psychology, showing brain scan data that indicated humans experienced a neurochemical response to group threats that actually increased their willingness to engage in dangerous behavior. "When you killed those civilians at Keeper's Gate," Karith said quietly, "you triggered a response that Deathworld evolution spent millions of years refining. And now you are facing a species whose survival instinct is not to flee or negotiate, but to eliminate the threat entirely." The commander was silent for several seconds, and Karith could see him processing the implications, his crystalline features flickering with patterns that indicated stress. "What do you recommend?" he finally asked, and the dismissive tone was completely gone. "Apologize," Karith said bluntly. "Offer massive reparations, surrender the individuals responsible for the attack, and hope that human leadership is willing to accept something other than total war." The commander's image flickered out without another word, and Karith sat back in her chair, knowing that her advice would be ignored, because the Genitar Supremacy's leadership would never believe that. Species they outnumbered 50 to 1 could pose a genuine threat. She marked the time on her chronometer and noted that 63 hours remained until humanity's deadline. And she began drafting a second report for her government recommending immediate defensive preparations along their borders, because once humans demonstrated what Deathworld species were capable of, the entire galaxy's understanding of military power was going to shift. The communication panel lit up again with another request for consultation, this time from the Council's Military Advisory Committee, and Karith accepted the call, preparing to explain once again that the galaxy had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were. They were not traitors who occasionally fought. She would tell them they were warriors who occasionally traded. And the Genitar Supremacy was about to learn the difference. The Genitar Supremacy's Third Fleet held position in perfect formation around their core system's outer defense perimeter. 3,000 warships arranged in layers that represented centuries of tactical doctrine, refined through dozens of minor conflicts with neighboring powers. Admiral Kress commanded from his flagship at the Formation Center, monitoring the tactical displays that showed his overwhelming numerical advantage over any force that humanity could possibly field. And he felt confident that this would be a brief demonstration of power followed by the inevitable human surrender. The countdown reached 12 hours, and long-range sensors began detecting human vessels entering Genitar space. But the readings made no sense, because instead of a coordinated fleet emerging from faster-than-light travel and standard battle formation, the humans were arriving in scattered groups from multiple vectors. Kress studied the tactical display with growing confusion, because military doctrine across every known species emphasized concentration of force and coordinated maneuvers. But the human vessels were spread across three-dimensional space in what appeared to be random dispersal patterns. His tactical officer reported vessel classifications, and Kress felt a surge of contempt when the analysis showed that most of the approaching ships were civilian craft, cargo haulers, colony transports, corporate mining vessels, and even what the database identified as recreational spacecraft designed for leisure travel between human settlements. They're sending civilians against a military fleet, Kress announced to his bridge crew. And several officers made sounds of disgust at the apparent human desperation. This confirms our assessment that Earth lacks adequate military resources and is attempting psychological warfare through unconventional tactics. The human vessels continued their approach, maintaining speeds that suggested they intended to enter weapons range within the hour. And Kress ordered his fleet to prepare firing solutions, while keeping shields at minimal power, to demonstrate his confidence in the outcome 6 minutes before the deadline expired. The lead group of human vessels crossed into extreme weapons range, and Kress expected them to decelerate and broadcast surrender terms, or at least attempt some kind of negotiation. Instead, they accelerated, their engines burning at maximum output as they drove directly toward the Genitar fleet's forward positions. Kress ordered warning shots fired, confident that the humans would break off their approach once they realized the Genitar were serious about defending their territory. But the human vessels did not slow or change course. The first collision happened so quickly that Kress's tactical officer barely had time to shout a warning before a human cargo hauler, its holds packed with conventional explosives and its reactor deliberately destabilized, slammed into a Genitar cruiser at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion vaporized both vessels instantly, and the expanding debris field tore through 3 nearby destroyers like shrapnel. And Kress stood frozen in shock as his tactical display showed 4 ships simply ceased to exist in the span of 2 seconds. More human vessels were coming, dozens of them now visible on sensors. And Kress suddenly understood with horrifying clarity that these were not military assets attempting unconventional tactics, but suicide weapons piloted by volunteers who had chosen to die in order to damage the Genitar fleet. All ships, evasive maneuvers. He screamed into the command channel, but 3,000 vessels in tight formation could not simply scatter without creating collision hazards and breaking defensive coordination. Emergency shields to maximum. Target all approaching vessels. The Genitar fleet began firing, their weapons tearing apart human ships at range. But for every vessel they destroyed, 2 more got through. And Kress watched in mounting horror as his carefully arranged battle formation dissolved into chaos. A colony transport loaded with industrial mining explosives detonated inside his fleet's second defensive layer. The blast wave crippling 8 ships simultaneously, and Kress saw the crew manifest flash across his screen, showing that the transport had carried 3,000 human civilians who had volunteered to become weapons. His tactical officer reported that the human vessels were using their faster-than-light drives in ways that violated every safety protocol in galactic space travel, making micro-jumps inside star systems to appear directly among Genitar ships before anyone could target them. A recreation yacht materialized 200 meters from a Genitar battleship and exploded with such force that the larger vessel's shields collapsed and its hull buckled, venting atmosphere and crew into the vacuum. And Kress realized that the humans had converted their pleasure craft into guided missiles. The assault continued for 18 minutes, and by the time the last suicide vessel detonated, the Third Fleet had lost 47% of its combat strength to an attack method that no military strategist in galactic history had ever seriously considered. Kress was still processing the casualty reports when his sensors officers screamed a new warning, and the tactical display lit up with fresh contacts emerging from faster-than-light travel at point-blank range to his crippled fleet. These were military vessels, their signatures matching the profiles in the database for Earth's actual combat ships, and they emerged from faster-than-light already firing, their weapons optimized for close-range devastation rather than the long-range dueling that characterized normal space combat. The human warships moved through the debris field like predators, targeting damaged Genitar vessels and finishing them with ruthless efficiency. And Kress noted with distant horror that the humans were not broadcasting surrender demands or attempting to capture ships, but simply destroying everything they encountered. His communications officer reported receiving surrender broadcasts from several Genitar captains whose ships were disabled, and Kress waited for the human forces to acknowledge the surrenders and begin taking prisoners according to galactic warfare conventions. Instead, the human ships ignored the broadcasts and continued firing, and Kress realized that humanity either did not know or did not care about the established rules that governed civilized warfare. All ships he broadcast on the emergency fleet channel, knowing that his career and possibly his life were over regardless of what happened next. Retreat to rally point Epsilon 7, maximum speed. Abandon formation discipline. The surviving Genitar vessels broke and ran, their faster-than-light drives engaging in rapid succession as captains desperately tried to escape the slaughter. And Kress's flagship was among the last to jump because he had to coordinate the retreat and ensure that as many ships as possible escaped as his vessel's drive spun up. He watched the tactical display showing human forces systematically hunting down the slowest Genitar ships, and he saw several human vessels literally ramming disabled Genitar craft to ensure they could not be recovered or repaired. The faster-than-light transition took him, and his flagship emerged 3 light-years away in what should have been safe space. But 17 other Genitar vessels that had jumped to the same coordinates were already engaged in desperate combat with human forces that had somehow anticipated their retreat. Vectocres ordered an immediate second jump, this time to completely random coordinates, and when his ship finally emerged in truly empty space, he had only 43 other vessels with him out of the 3,000 that had started the engagement. His communications officer was receiving reports from other survivors, scattered across 2 sectors, and the total count came to roughly 800 ships that had escaped, which meant humanity had destroyed or captured over 70% of the Third Fleet in less than 1 hour of actual combat. Kress sat in his command chair and stared at the empty tactical display, trying to understand what had just happened. And his mind kept returning to those civilian vessels loaded with explosives and piloted by volunteers who had chosen death over allowing his fleet to remain intact. He opened a priority channel to Xanatar High Command and prepared to deliver the worst military defeat in his species' recorded history. And he knew that his report would be dismissed as exaggeration or hysteria because no military force in galactic history fought like the humans had just fought. They are not fighting a war, he said into the recorder, trying to find words that would make his superiors understand. They are fighting an extermination, and we are the target, the message transmitted. And Kress began plotting jump coordinates that would take his survivors as far from human space as possible, because he understood something that the rest of the Xanatar supremacy could not yet comprehend. Humanity had not been bluffing, and the 72-hour deadline had not been a negotiation tactic, but a warning to evacuate civilians from the target zone. And now the galaxy was going to learn what happened when Deathworlders decided that talking was finished. The galactic news networks struggled to process the flood of information coming from Xanatar space, and every species with listening posts or surveillance assets was detecting the same impossible reality. Humanity's military forces were advancing through 7 sectors simultaneously while maintaining supply lines and coordination that should have been beyond the capabilities of their limited infrastructure. Council Arbiter Velomon convened emergency sessions every 6 hours to review the situation, and each update brought fresh horrors that challenged everything the Council thought they understood about warfare and civilization. Human forces were deploying biological weapons tailored to Xanatar physiology, releasing engineered viruses into environmental systems that caused debilitating illness without killing, forcing the Xanatar to divert resources to medical care while their military effectiveness collapsed. The weapons were frighteningly precise. Velomon learned from the intelligence briefings, targeting only Xanatar biology while leaving other species and even related subspecies completely unaffected, which suggested that humanity had been preparing for this conflict far longer than their 72-hour deadline implied. Kinetic bombardment was destroying Xanatar industrial centers, and the humans were using simple physics rather than exotic weapons, dropping dense metal rods from orbit and letting gravity do the work, which meant the attacks could not be intercepted by energy shields designed to stop directed energy weapons. Velomon watched footage of a Xanatar manufacturing complex being struck by a kinetic projectile, the impact releasing more energy than a tactical nuclear weapon but leaving no radiation or chemical contamination. Just a crater where millions of workers had been producing military equipment. The computer networks across Xanatar space were failing, and Council intelligence determined that human cyber warfare specialists were deploying virus bombs that corrupted artificial intelligence systems, turning automated defenses against their operators and spreading through connected networks like wildfire through dry vegetation. What disturbed Velomon most was the pattern he was seeing in human combat behavior, because unlike every other species in galactic history, human forces did not slow down or become less aggressive when they took casualties. A Xanatar garrison had successfully ambushed a human armored column destroying 60% of their vehicles and inflicting what should have been psychologically devastating losses. But the surviving humans had regrouped and assaulted the garrison anyway, taking it through sheer determination despite suffering. Additional casualties that should have triggered retrieval men studied the combat recordings and saw human soldiers advancing under fire, watched them drag wounded companions to cover while continuing to shoot at enemy positions, and observed their apparent inability to comprehend the concept of acceptable losses. His military advisors explained that human doctrine appeared to value mission completion over force preservation, which meant that once humans committed to an objective, they would pursue it regardless of cost. And this made them unpredictable and terrifying opponents. The Council received a formal petition from the Genitar Supremacy requesting immediate intervention to halt human aggression, and Valamon expected the human representative to use this as leverage for negotiation. Because surely Earth would prefer Council-mediated peace to the enormous cost of continued warfare. Director Okonkwo arrived at the Council chambers exactly on time, and Valamon noticed that she looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting she had not been sleeping adequately. But her expression was the same calm determination he had seen when she declared war. The Genitar Supremacy requests that the Council compel humanity to cease military operations, Valamon said, using his most diplomatic tone. We are prepared to mediate a settlement that addresses your legitimate grievances while ending this destructive conflict. Okonkwo stood silently for several seconds, and Valamon felt uncomfortable under her steady gaze, as if she was evaluating him and finding him lacking in some fundamental way. Ambassador Chun spent 15 years working for peace, she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. He believed that dialogue could solve any problem, and the Genitar killed him for that belief. Valamon started to respond with standard diplomatic language about tragic misunderstandings and the importance of moving forward. But Okonkwo raised her hand in a gesture that clearly meant silence, and he found himself actually stopping mid-sentence. You want us to negotiate, she continued. But negotiation implies that both sides have something the other wants, and the Genitar have nothing we need except acknowledgement of their crime and acceptance of consequences. The chamber buzzed with confused translations, and Valamon tried to explain that warfare itself was supposed to be the leverage that led to negotiation, that the purpose of military action was to strengthen one's position at the bargaining table. We are not at the bargaining table, Okonkwo stated flatly. We announced war, not arbitration, and the Genitar chose to ignore our warning because they assumed we were posturing like civilized species do. She pulled up a holographic display showing maps of Genitar territory with human forces marked in red, and Valamon saw with growing alarm that humanity controlled, or had, bypassed every major Genitar military installation in 4 sectors. Your council has rules about warfare, Okonkwo said, highlighting sections of galactic law. Rules about acceptable targets, treatment of prisoners, use of certain weapons, and most importantly, rules about negotiating before committing to total war. Valamon nodded, relieved that she understood the framework that governed civilized conflict, but then she smiled. And it was not a friendly expression. We are not bound by rules we did not help create, she said. And we certainly are not going to let the people who murdered our civilians hide behind galactic law that they themselves violated. The Genitar representative stood and began shouting about human barbarism and Deathworlder savagery, and several other council members joined him, demanding that humanity be sanctioned for refusing to negotiate in good faith. Okonkwo waited for the noise to die down, and then she played a recording that made Valamon's 3 hearts sink, because it showed Genitar forces executing human prisoners who had surrendered during the opening days of the war. You want to discuss galactic law, Okonkwo said quietly. freezing the image on a human soldier being shot while restrained. Here's the Xanatar supremacy following the rules you claim we are violating. The chamber fell silent, and Velamon knew that the Xanatar had just lost any moral authority they might have claimed, because executing prisoners was one of the few absolute violations that galactic society recognized. We are observing one rule, Okonkwo continued, pulling up new footage that showed human forces establishing medical stations in occupied territory and distributing food to Xanatar civilians. We separate combatants from non-combatants, and we do not harm those who are not fighting. Velamon studied the recordings and saw human soldiers providing medical care to wounded Xanatar civilians, saw supply convoys delivering food and water to occupied cities, and saw construction teams rebuilding infrastructure that the fighting had damaged. Every Xanatar who surrenders and disarms is treated according to standards far exceeding your galactic conventions, Okonkwo said, highlighting a prisoner facility where Xanatar soldiers were being housed in clean barracks with adequate food and medical care. Every civilian who stays out of the fighting receives our protection and assistance. She closed the displays and turned to face the council directly. And Velamon saw something in her eyes that terrified him more than the military reports and casualty statistics. But every Xanatar who continues to fight will discover that humans do not quit, she said. We will pursue this war until the Xanatar supremacy no longer exists as a political entity capable of threatening human lives. The Xanatar representative began protesting that this was genocide, that humanity intended to wipe out his species. But Okonkwo shook her head. We are not targeting your species, she said calmly. We are dismantling your government, destroying your military, and occupying your territory until we can establish a system that ensures this never happens again. Velamon tried one last diplomatic approach, suggesting that perhaps if the Xanatar leadership offered unconditional surrender and turned over those responsible for the attack at Keeper's Gate, humanity might be willing to discuss terms. They can surrender, Okonkwo agreed, and when they do, we will accept it and begin the process of rebuilding their society into something that respects sentient life. But there will be no negotiation about consequences. She turned to leave, and Velamon called out desperately, asking what humanity wanted, what would satisfy them. What would end this war? Okonkwo paused at the chamber doors and looked back at him with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. We want the 847 people who died at Keeper's Gate to come back, she said. And since we cannot have that, we will settle for ensuring that no one ever again believes they can murder humans without facing the full consequences of that choice. 3 months after Director Okonkwo's war declaration, the Xanatar supremacy ceased to exist as a unified government, and council observers watched as the last holdout systems surrendered to human occupation forces who arrived not with conquest fleets but with construction equipment and medical supplies. The transition was so unlike any military occupation in galactic history that Velamon had to personally visit the former Xanatar capital world to believe the reports his staff was sending. And what he saw there challenged every assumption he had made about human intentions. Human peacekeeping forces controlled the planetary, orbital space, and major cities, but instead of looting or subjugating the population, they were rebuilding infrastructure at a pace that seemed impossible given the resources available. Velamon stood in what had been the supremacy's central government complex and watched human engineers working alongside Xanatar civilians to restore power generation facilities, while medical teams from Earth established hospitals that treated anyone who needed care, regardless of their role in the recent conflict. Human commander of the occupation force was a general named Martinez who met with Velamon in an office that still bore scorch marks from the fighting. that had taken the building. "We are not here to rule the Genitar people," Martinez explained, showing Velamon the reconstruction plans that covered his desk. "We are here to ensure that the government that replaces the supremacy is one chosen by Genitar civilians through free and fair elections." Velamon struggled to understand the logic. Because if humanity was not seeking territory or resources or subjugation, then what was the point of the enormous cost they had paid in ships and lives to win this war? "Justice," Martinez said simply when Velamon asked. "We fought because the Genitar supremacy murdered our people and believed there would be no consequences. And now we are ensuring that the Genitar people have a government that will not make that mistake again." The general pulled up detailed plans for democratic institutions, educational reforms, and economic reconstruction programs that would cost Earth billions of credits and require decades of commitment. "You are going to just give them democracy and leave?" Velamon asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "We are going to help them build democracy, and then yes, we will leave," Martinez confirmed. "We are not interested in empire, Arbiter. We are interested in preventing future massacres." Velamon toured the occupied zones and saw this pattern repeated everywhere. Human forces maintaining order while civilian administrators worked with local Genitar to establish new governance structures. Human agricultural specialists helping restore food production. And human teachers training Genitar educators in what they called civic responsibility. The resistance movements that had formed during the initial occupation were collapsing. Not because humans were crushing them militarily, but because Genitar civilians were choosing to cooperate with occupiers who fed them, healed them, and genuinely seemed committed to helping them rebuild. Kirith joined Velamon during his tour, and the xenobiologist explained that this was consistent with human psychology as she understood it. "They separate combatants from civilians with absolute clarity," she said, showing him footage of human soldiers risking their lives to evacuate Genitar families from combat zones. Once the fighting is over, the Genitar civilians are not enemies. They are victims of the supremacy's bad leadership. Velamon watched a human medical team performing surgery on a Genitar child injured during the fighting, and he saw the same focused determination in their faces that he had seen in Director Okonkwo when she declared war. They are just as committed to rebuilding as they were to destroying, Kirith observed. This is what Deathworlder evolution creates. Beings who pursue their objectives with total commitment, regardless of whether those objectives are violent or peaceful. The Galactic Council convened a summit to address humanity's actions, and every species sent their highest-ranking officials, because it was clear that the galaxy's power dynamics had fundamentally shifted. Director Okonkwo stood before the full assembly, and Velamon noticed that she looked less tired now, as if the burden of warfare had been partially lifted even though the occupation continued. Humanity requests that the Council witness the formal return of Genitar worlds to Genitar control, she announced, and the chamber erupted in confused discussion. Because no one had expected humans to actually follow through on their promise to leave. She displayed the timeline. Human forces would supervise elections over the next 80 months, ensure that new governments were stable and legitimate, and then withdraw completely from Genitar space. "We are also establishing a memorial at Keeper's Gate Station," she continued, showing architectural plans for a monument. "It will commemorate all who died in the attack and serve as a reminder of why this war was necessary." The Genitar's interim government representative, a civilian administrator named Velcris, who had been elected by the occupied population, stood and addressed the council. "On behalf of the Genitar people," Velcris said, his voice shaking slightly, "I offer formal apology for the actions of the supremacy, and express gratitude to the human forces who could have destroyed us but chose instead to help us build something better." Velamon watched this exchange and realized that Humanity had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had won a war so completely that the defeated enemy was thanking. Then McConquille raised her hand for silence and presented the council with a proposal that would reshape galactic law. We recommend that the council establish a new framework for responding to attacks on civilian populations, she said. Displaying the draft legislation, any government that commits acts of war against unarmed civilians will face not negotiation or sanctions, but immediate military intervention by willing council members. The proposal included provisions for rapid response forces, clear definitions of civilian versus military targets, and most importantly, the explicit authorization for what the document called Deathworlder enforcement. You want to make human-style warfare official council policy? Valmont asked, shocked by the implications. We want to make it clear that murdering civilians has consequences that cannot be negotiated away. Okonkwo replied, and yes, we are volunteering to be part of the enforcement mechanism. The debate lasted for hours, but in the end, the resolution passed with only 3 abstentions. Because every species in the chamber had watched what happened to the Genitar supremacy and understood that opposing humanity on this issue would be both morally indefensible and strategically foolish. As the session ended and representatives filed out, Valamon approached Okonkwo and asked the question that had been troubling him since the war began. Why did you give them 72 hours warning? He said, you could have struck without notice and achieved even more devastating surprise. Okonkwo looked at him with an expression that suggested she found the question strange. Because we wanted Genitar civilians to have time to evacuate from military installations, she said. We were going to war with their government and military, not with innocent people. She started to leave. But Valamon had one more question. What happens the next time someone attacks human civilians? He asked it. Okonkwo's expression hardened, and Valamon saw again that determination that had terrified him during the war. Declaration. They will discover that humanity does not forget and does not forgive attacks on our people, she said. But they will also discover that if they separate themselves from those responsible and cooperate with justice, we are capable of remarkable mercy. Years passed, and the galaxy adjusted to its new reality, where humans maintained a relatively small military by numerical standards but possessed a reputation that made actual deployment unnecessary. Monitored the situation from his position as council arbiter and noted that border disputes declined sharply, that aggressive posturing between species became rare, and that governments showed remarkable restraint when dealing with their neighbors. The Tadip, the meters, the memorial at Keeper's Gate Station was completed. A beautiful structure that honored the dead, while serving as a reminder of the consequences of violence against civilians. Skirth published a comprehensive study of Deathworld species integration, and it became required reading for every diplomatic and military academy in the galaxy. The Genitar held their 3rd free election under their new democratic system, and human observers certified it as legitimate before formally ending the occupation and withdrawing the last peacekeeping forces. Minor Empire, called the Vrel Confederation, began making aggressive moves toward a human mining colony, and their strategic planning computers analyzed the situation and recommended immediate cessation of hostile actions. The report that reached the Vrel leadership was simple and devastating. Conflict with humanity inadvisable. Deathworlder response certain. Numerical advantages irrelevant. Recommend diplomatic resolution. The Vrel ambassador contacted the human colony within hours and offered to negotiate mineral rights. Peaceful watched from the council chambers and understood that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented. They had fought one war so decisively that future wars became unnecessary.